why the hell aren't we having hard drive checks for police officers and judges? Because frankly, what rape victim deserves to stand in front of a judge knowing that he will have been looking at the same sort of pornography that may have been made of her?
I'm Jane.
Hi, my name's Jo Bartosch. I'm a journalist, a feminist, and I'm assistant editor at The Critic magazine.
And I'm Bets.
And this is
Insightful Sisters.
Hello. We're very lucky to have Jo Bartosch with us for today's episode. She's a writer, a feminist. She writes for Spiked, The Telegraph, The Times, The New Statesman. She's just submitted a book. I think your second book, is it, Jo?
No, actually, it's my first.
It's
so
your
yes,
first?
I'm quite excited. I've co-authored it with Rob Jessel, who is a sort of gender critical activist, if you like, and also a writer.
And your book's about pornography, isn't it?
It is, yes. It won't be published for a little while. It'll be much later this year. But it's called Pornography, and it will be looking at basically how pornography has changed the world from the level of synapses right through to society.
I was wondering what you'd called it. I wondered how you put together a title for a book. Is it really, really difficult to think of a title?
Well, to be honest, I knew what we were going to write about, and no, it just sort of popped into my head because I genuinely believe it has such a profound impact on the way that we think, the way that we view one another, even increasingly the way we identify ourselves. And I think it's also impacting on legislation. So it kind of did feel, it's a system of power. We are being ruled by the pornocrats. So it seemed fairly obvious, really. I guess Patriarchy Mark II is the pornocracy.
Amazing. It's a brilliant title. I imagine it's going to do what it says on the tin exactly. So how do you put together something like that? How do you structure a book on the pornocracy?
My interest is obviously sexual politics and the social side of things. So I've got a real interest in how, for example, lobby groups and international bodies like WPATH, who I know Genevieve Gluck has written a lot about, how their policies and how their aims as a movement are informed by pornography, similarly with queer theory. So I've been quite interested in unpicking those sorts of strands and looking at how pornography impacts social movements and policy. Rob has had much more of an interest in the brain and looking at the addictive qualities of pornography, how it inspires very similar reward circuits, that it strengthens are very similar to those that you see in addicts. But obviously, there's a lot of controversy around granting porn addiction status. There's been some quite heavy resistance from that. And in some sense, that makes sense because you don't want to let pornography users off the hook and to open a whole can of worms there. But at the same time, it clearly is as effective as a drug. But then going back to my bit, I've also looked at crime, how pornography influences criminal behaviour, and how it's increasingly sort of both evidence of and the recording of rapes and sexual assaults, and also the fuel for rapes and sexual assaults. And then at a more sort of social level, it's the way that men bond and boys bond with one another over the abuse of women. So there are lots of different sort of strands that we've fed through, and I think it's been quite helpful that we've had quite different perspectives on it.
Bounced ideas off each other.
Yeah. And, I'd like to say that there was a sort of wider philosophical reason as to why I chose to write it with a man, but actually we just happen to live in the same town. And got a similar interest, so it worked.
Excellent. I'm always struck when I read anything by you. I mean, the gender critical feminist world can get a bit fractious at times, can't it? And I'm always struck, I read something by you and I see people commenting on it from the whole spectrum of who we are. You seem to be able to write really clearly and succinctly with your message without pissing anyone off, or I feel that's a real strength. They obviously don't show it on X because you don't get that sense from you. I mean,
yeah, I try to avoid taking sides or being too. I think it's very. I feel like we're conditioned as women to find fault in one another and to find flaws in one another and to critique each other's activism. So even though sometimes I am itching to say, such and such was a right cow, I really do my best to hold it in where I can, because I just don't think, on the grander scheme of things, it's productive. And I just feel it's exactly playing into the hands of the very people we should be united against.
We're such a broad movement, aren't we? And we've come to it for such different reasons sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we should be a broad movement, and I think, to not to sound too corny, but I think there's a real strength in that. In fact, I've addressed that slightly in the book, in that looking at the fact that you're going to have Christian conservative fathers who object to drag queen story hour, and to be honest, if we can find a common cause of radical feminists, so much the better. And I don't think there's anything to be lost from that particularly. I think that can only be a win-win.
Can you remember the first thing you wrote and the first time you put your toe in the water and in this area of writing? I mean, have you always written about women and feminism?
No, so I used to be an activist. I used to run a group called Chelt Femmes, and it was that was sort of 15 years ago or so now. And as part of that, I had a blog. And then somebody who was in the group said, the local paper are looking for columnists, maybe you should give it a go. So I thought, all right. So I just sort of started doing an occasional column for them on sort of feminist topics. It was just content filler, really, for them. And it was, I mean, the town that I was from, so it's Cheltenham, they have a real problem during race week, where basically sex industry workers of various sorts, so prostituted women, lap dancers, are just literally busting, and it's horrific. And
the races.
That's for the races. And so, it's quite a well-heeled town, and it's got a very polished reputation, and yet it's got this sort of revolting, seedy underbelly. So I wrote about that quite a lot, which obviously made me deeply unpopular.
Yeah.
And then I just thought I'd give pitching to national papers a go. So I think one of the first pieces I had published in a mainstream publication was about the transition of children. And there was a couple in the Isle of Wight, and they were a Christian couple, and they got sneered at so badly for wanting to take their children out of school because they were being taught all sorts of nonsense about gender identity. So I made the point that actually, no, it was homophobic. And I think it was one of the first pieces, that was 2017, and I think it was one of the first pieces that looked at the issue of childhood transition and looked at what was going on at the Tavistock. And as a result of that, I had a huge backlash. And there was sort of lots of gnashing of teeth and frothing. They asked me to change the article retrospectively, and I said no, because they wanted me to cite WPATH, and I refused. As sort of, to cite them as authorities and to suggest that in fact they had the settled way of doing things. So I'm really quite pleased I stuck to my guns.
What foresight.
I've sort of fallen into journalism and into writing, and I just sort of started pitching, and I always did it alongside other jobs. And then around about 5 years ago or so, I realised that I could kind of make a living doing it on its own. So that's what I've been doing.
Well, we're all really, I'm really looking forward to reading this.
Oh, thank you.
We wanted to focus, we thought it might be interesting to focus on boys and porn.
Mm-hmm.
First, as I suppose the market, because boys are marketed to, really, aren't they? They are drawn in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to use the word groomed, but they're.
Oh, I think they are.
Do you?
Yeah, I do.
So how does it happen? How do boys? I've got a vested interest. I've got a grandson that's 4, so whatever you say now is going to keep him safe and healthy.
No pressure then. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, to be brutal, you can't keep them safe. I mean, thankfully, the age verification is being brought in this year. I think that will stop some of the sort of accidental traffic, because providers, wherever they're based, will have to make sure that they have processes in place to stop children accessing pornography. However, at the moment, most children actually come across it through social media. And the average age of exposure, so according to the Children's Commission, it's 13. I've actually heard it's quite. I've read other studies that have suggested it's younger than that. It's 11. It's certainly 11 for boys, but I think 13 for both sexes. And I mean the pornographers aren't stupid. They know that their industry depends upon getting users hooked. And the younger a child is exposed to pornography, the more likely they are then to seek out extreme content and to develop an addiction. So, it's in their interests to get them hooked early, and they do. So they exploit keystroke errors to direct children to porn sites. There were things like so there were pornified versions of cartoons like Frozen. Those are available now on Pornhub. So they've actually got sort of cartoons that are blurring the boundaries between real porn and cartoon porn. There are also some really cynical techniques. So I know in 2019 they Pornhub posted a picture of the Mandalorian character, the baby Yoda character from the Mandalorian, and it was 30 seconds after my parents leave the room, and it was the Pornhub logo reflected in his eyes. And then they deleted it. So, but clearly they know who they're targeting.
I mean, Frozen is really young children watch Frozen.
Yeah, it's pretty grotesque. Obviously, gaming, I think boys in particular who are more likely to play video games, there's a huge problem with grooming and then being targeted and then being coerced into sending explicit photographs of themselves. And then those can be then used to blackmail them, or indeed being shown pornography by older men. Most of the child abuse material that's online is self-generated. Around 97% of it is self-generated. And that's because kids are being groomed through webcams, basically. And that's pretty terrifying. I know you want to focus on boys, but as a girl I spoke to, and I think it just sort of illustrates the point. So she was 12 and she clicked on a pop-up because she was looking for Taylor Swift videos, and it was porn. And then she started looking at porn quite regularly. To start with, she was quite disgusted by it. And then I think when you're traumatized, quite often that behavior is repeated. And that you sort
Children are curious as well, and they try and make sense of things, don't they?
Yeah, of course they are. It can get embedded very quickly. And then she started looking at more and more extreme things to try and sort of work out her feelings. And she ended up in the porn industry, and she traced it back to being a direct result of having seen that, having her idea that sex shouldn't be enjoyable or mutual, that it was something to be extracted, if you like, something that was painful, something that was abusive. So she thought, well, why not monetize it? So I think that sort of sense of dissociation affects both girls and boys.
Yeah. What impact does it have on them?
The thing that pornography does is it shapes sexual scripts, and those have changed markedly. So things that were once totally niche, like choking, strangulation, or heterosexual anal sex, or having your hair pulled, being slapped, stuff that's quite violent, that is kind of normal in porn. A report from the Children's Commissioner found 42% of both sexes believe that girls physically enjoy sexually aggressive acts. And in the US, I think it's 2020, there was a survey, and a fifth of young women report that they've been choked during sex. Obviously, there are now additional pressures, such as being expected to send naked images, and then obviously those get shared around. So it's a really sort of vicious cycle that kids can get really easily pulled into.
The other thing it might do is that it drives a wedge inside families, because you're essentially making a child have a secret, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah. And of course, that's exactly so when you said earlier on that you didn't think you should call it grooming, actually, I kind of do, because I think they know that. I think porn companies know that. It's their little secret, like that baby Yoda character. Whether, after my parents leave the room, that sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. So for the book, we interviewed some experts who work with sex offenders. Notably, one of them worked with Barry Burnell, the football coach. He spoke about how secrets are used to gain trust, to gain a relationship. And I think as increasingly kids are learning to live online, that can be done very easily online. And it really gives them a sort of, they feel a part of something. And we know that as well, part of the sort of process of growing up as a boy in what I would argue is a patriarchal society is that part of learning to be a man is suppressing emotion, is instrumentalizing people, is replacing people and feelings for objects. So, whether it's the fast car or whether it's indeed, as, for example, Andrew Tate does, the girlfriend that he has on his arm. It's that sort of idea that people and objects can be replaced. And I think particularly for boys, of course they're going to feel insecure about having their first relationships. We all do. If your relationship is with pornography, or even if it's sort of directed through a webcam, and you're telling a woman what you want her to do, she's not going to laugh at you. She's not going to reject you. She's not going to reject you. She's not going to make you feel like less of a. So I can really understand how it plays on those vulnerabilities and can sort of really hook children, in particularly boys, into a very unhealthy way of being, an unhealthy way of viewing relationships.
You said people living online, and that I do find that quite distressing when I talk to people who have teenagers, that the hours and hours that they spend online, which means that they're not spending time, with their friends, just socializing, mucking about outside the chip shop, and all those sorts of things, flirting, all of those skills that you're not getting.
And I think as a wider problem, I think those interpersonal skills that you sort of need to form a healthy relationship are going to be totally lacking for a generation who have been brought up online, and increasingly being diagnosed with various isms and all the rest of it. And you can't help thinking, well, maybe if they sort of, spent time touching another person, getting to know another person, rather than communicating through what is, almost sort of fetishizing screens, if you like. But of course, pornography, it not only desensitizes them to genuine connection, it also you end up building a relationship with what you see online. That becomes the only way you react. So there's lots of information out there about porn-induced erectile dysfunction, which is a huge problem among young men, and it never used to be. But it's not actually erectile dysfunction, because they can get erections when they look at pornography. They can't get erections when they're with a woman. So they are developing a relationship with a screen.
I mean, it's a terrifying idea. I feel that we've lost the way for children to find out who they need to be, and also they're replacing real experiences with a sort of theory almost. They find out so much about not the theory, but they've, as you said, they find out about the practice of sex in very abnormal ways, rather than through the real experiences that we used to have.
And I mean, there was another sort of part of what we covered. There was a man who he was actually interviewed in The Guardian, and it was just something Rob picked up on. And this chap said, my girlfriend loves being strangled. I always strangle her during sex. And he then got back to the journalist a couple of weeks later and said, "Oh, actually, I had a chat with her, and it turns out she doesn't like it at all. She said she thought I liked it, so she was putting up with it." And I think those sorts of sort of total breakdowns in communication are happening because of these sort of porn-influenced sexual scripts.
Yeah.
And I mean, the other really grisly thing that I think nobody ever wants to acknowledge or admit, but just because it's so frightening, is that actually we know there have been multiple surveys that show around 30%, between 30% and a third of men admit that they would force sex, is the terminology used, on a woman if there were no consequences for them doing so. So that is a huge number of men who are already prepared to be sexually violent. If they change it, when the researchers change the terminology and use the word rape, that drops to around about 13%. But there are 13% who admit that they would commit rape. And then there's a further 10% within that who admit that they have committed rape. So I think, we like to comfort ourselves with the idea that sexual violence is rare, that it's, not all men. And no, right, it's not all men, but it's enough of them for that to be very, very concerning, particularly then when you add into that already high baseline the idea that women enjoy violence and that real men perpetrate violence.
I know when the Pellico case was happening, we saw the men queuing up outside the court, ready to go in. And at the same time, there was the OnlyFans thing happening, where the men were queuing up outside that room.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I wasn't the only one, obviously.
No, I thought the same. It was absolutely grotesque, and just there's that, and then everyone goes on about bloody consent, and you think, well, it's not only about her consent. Each one of those men could have said no, could have not done it.
Yeah.
And they chose to. And that's I think, I really hate the consent narrative of this, some sort of cure-all. We know it just isn't at all. And it's very difficult to find data that's disaggregated by sex. They normally refer to children or, offenders or gendered violence. And obviously, most of the time, it is boys and men perpetrating against girls and women. But for the first time last year, the National Police Council reported that there had been an increase of 7.6% in child sexual abuses from the previous year. And for the first time, the majority of the abuse was carried out by children under 18. So this is children committing child sexual offences against other children. And that is obviously, to my mind, that is so obviously pornogenic.
Yeah. What can parents do? What can governments do? What can the internet companies do? What can anybody do?
I think one of the first things that needs to be done is we need a bloody overhaul of what's happening in schools. So there are so many, frankly, dodgy third-party providers who go into schools and tell kids that porn's okay, that it's a treat, that it's it's a healthy part of a sex life. No, it bloody isn't. And we need them to be vetted, and we need anyone who is sort of touting anything like that out. I think age verification will protect some children. It's not the answer. Obviously, that it's used VPNs and all the rest of it to get around it. But it's a start. I think actually we have quite a few laws. So I know the government have recently introduced laws banning AI-generated deepfake pornography of people, and there's sort of positive steps being taken. But laws mean nothing if the police aren't going to actually enforce them. And I think that's what we need. We need a sort of a change in attitudes, which I think involves grassroots action. And we need them to actually start bloody enforcing the laws that they have. So, for example, I think it's 86% of extreme pornography cases. So extreme pornography is a category in its own right where there's severe injury to the breast or the anus or vagina, and it also includes bestiality. 86% of the prosecutions for it are for bestiality, because that's obviously easier to prove. Because obviously there's no issue of consent there. It's obvious that you can prove it, which kind of means there's a presumption that women are okay with what happens to the rest of the time, So there's a real problem with attitudes, and that needs to change. And I think that probably points at something social and campaign-based as much as it does any legal solution. I think we probably have the laws. Rob, who I wrote the book with, he is very interested in the concept of shame, and trying to get men in particular just to feel a sense of shame to make.
I'm a big fan of shame. I'm a big fan. A kink shaming, what is that about? It's just stupid. I know Bex is going to ask you about that later, but I'm all for it.
No, absolutely. And I think there's definitely something to be said there with shame. Also, I think making sure that we hold social media companies to account, making sure that we actually, have some high profile heads roll to change this. But ultimately, I guess there's been years and years and years of feminist campaigns that haven't lessened men's appetite for pornography, trying to, shout from the rooftops that we're human beings and this isn't okay. It doesn't seem to be working. So it's very hard. But I think legislation is, I don't think it's entirely pointless, because you look at things like the Nordic model and the dramatic effect that has. So I think it's worth something. And I think apart from anything else, it sends a signal that this is the line, that this isn't acceptable. But I really do think it drives me batty. We've got, lessons in schools on Andrew Tate, and yet at the same time, kids are being taught that pornography is okay. And we've got panic around zombie knives, and them being banned, and and then there was the whole kitchen knife ban thing, and all these sort of ridiculous pussyfooting around the edges. Whereas actually, you look at pornography as a driver of male sexual violence, and no one would ever conceive of banning it. And actually, I think the same sort of approach should be taken. I also think, were it unacceptable, were there a sense of shame, why the hell aren't we having, and this sounds really extreme, and I know I'm going to get ribbed for it, but why the hell aren't we having hard drive checks for police officers and judges? Because frankly, what rape victim deserves to stand in front of a judge knowing that he will have been looking at the same sort of pornography that may have been made of her? I really think that we need to sort of stop considering pornography a matter of freedom of speech. It isn't. It's about closing down women's speech and closing down our humanity and stopping people from recognizing our humanity. So I think we need to sort of readdress how we think about freedom of speech and what measures we're prepared to take to stop sexual exploitation.
Thank you for that. We've got like a list there, and I think you should probably run for government somewhere. Or certainly write a manifesto for somebody. That would be a womanifesto. That would be a very good thing to do. I'm going to pass across to Bex because I know that I'm risking straying onto her questions.
Okay.
I get told off for that.
Okay, fair enough.
I tell her off with my eyes.
That's right.
I'm listening to that in absolute fascination. You've sort of given us some really good examples there of things that we can and really should do to get on top of this issue. What happens if we don't intervene? You know, where is that leading us at the moment?
I think public space. I think the fact that women are being predated on, are being turned into, and girls are being turned into pornography, even when they use public toilets, means that we are going to end up with hyper-vigilant women in public space, which is sort of, I know this sounds really extreme, but when I think about Islamic theocracies and women being covered up, well, what the hell are we going to do to stop ourselves being turned into pornography? Are we going to start avoiding running for public office because we're going to have deepfake porn made of us? There's already been cases of teachers being so badly bullied by boys using pornography at schools that they've dropped out of the teaching system. So, this is so uncontrollable, and it empowers just the worst elements of masculine behaviour to the extent that it could almost push women out of public life. I also think in terms of policies, I think so many of the issues with both transgenderism and surrogacy, and just the instrumentalization of women's bodies, the idea that we're objects to be chopped up and used, and that we are sort of no more than vehicles for male fantasies, is directly downstream of pornography. So I think it's interesting, in particular, when you look at, for example, the erasure of women's spaces. And you look at queer theory, which is obviously about sort of erasing boundaries and sort of getting rid of the very concept of woman. And then you look at, well, who benefits from being able to put cameras in gender neutral toilets? I realise that sounds paranoid, but actually there is a direct impact from those sorts of laws that say women aren't allowed to have their own spaces to pornography. And also I think it's downstream of pornography, it's downstream of pornified thinking, because women either have a choice of being sex objects or mother objects with surrogacy. These sort of ideas that we are being broken into our component parts, that we're wholes essentially. I think it's a very, very sort of pornified way of conceiving of womanhood. And I think we can expect to see more mining of women's bodies, if you like, whether that's from sort of big fertility or through pornography. I think it'll be the erasure of women from public space and our reduction to chattels, essentially.
I really want to talk to you about entitlement, because we're seeing an increase in entitlement to women across the board in ways that you've sort of mentioned, surrogacy. We're seeing sort of an increase in men's entitlement within relationships and within sex. Things like Andrew Tate and trafficking, but also what you touched on there, and entitlement to women's spaces, and this sort of outrage at the concept of women having even a single space to themselves inside of a city, a town, a country.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this happening, and what can we do to stop it?
I think the reason the violent reaction is happening is because men get very upset when you tell them no, particularly if they base their identity on what's essentially a fetish. I think when that's exposed, that's very destabilizing for them. And I think it just sort of upsets their worldview and sort of forces them to acknowledge that indeed there are more than just them in the world. I think that's deeply destabilizing. As I say, I think when it comes to policies being enacted by NGOs and being sort of pushed for by NGOs, whether that's ILGA or whether that's Prostasia, who are or Before You Act, the last two are essentially pro-paedophile organisations. And I'm being very careful about what I say because I don't want to get sued. But I think they have, perhaps for the best of intentions, but their whole remit, the whole way they frame things is about destigmatizing what I think actually should be very much stigmatized, and a reconception of that as a legitimate sexuality. And that, of course, again ties into pornography, because we know that what is watched, what men watch, and it is predominantly men, and they're women as well, escalates in the severity of the content and the extremity of the content. So to get the same sort of hit, because it's like a drug, you have to go for more and more extreme content. So things that would have previously disgusted you, you end up getting drawn towards. Added to that, obviously, there are very sophisticated algorithms that target users. So you then end up with them sort of drawn into these sort of vortices of sort of particularly twisted fantasies, which mean they're unable to relate to other people, which foster a sense of alienation, and yes, which lead to some really, really dark policies. So when it comes to WPATH, Genevieve Gluck, I know, has done some really interesting work looking at how their lobbying has been influenced by an online forum which was known as the Eunuch Archives. And interestingly, in their version 8 guidelines, standards of care guidelines, they had a whole chapter on eunuch identity, and sort of suggested that anybody, including children, should be castrated should they wish to be. So, that sounds like something dystopian and mad and horrific, but actually I think it's pretty obvious that that's downstream of pornography.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm particularly interested in how that ties in with what seems to be a massive rise in normalization of sort of kink, fetishes, paraphilias. With paraphilias in particular, my understanding is that often they start during childhood with some form of exposure and then sort of manifest from there. I mean, how are these things linked? Because these are definitely coming into real life, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. And I think we need to start looking at exposure to pornography as children, as being an adverse childhood experience, as something that will traumatize children, and that will mean that they then potentially go on to replicate quite harmful behaviors that they may have seen, because that is a pattern that does happen. And that's that I don't think that's really been acknowledged, that actually a lot of these adults enacting particularly creepy things will have been damaged as children through exposure to pornography. I think people have become so detached from what they want, who they are. I think there's a sense of confusion. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that Andrew Tate, who defines a woman basically as someone he would stick his dick into, and he has said that he thinks it's not gay for a man to have sex with another man who identifies as a woman, which I think is telling in and of itself. But that his version of what a woman is matches Stonewall's version of what a woman is, I think is kind of revealing as to how entrenched, and kind of how there's almost like a subscript running along through men's minds, particularly, that women are there to be penetrated, and what makes a woman is being penetrated.
We spoke to Alison Ellis previously, and she made a very similar point about her experience as a young person in a youth LGBTQ group, where people were introducing themselves as demisexual when they hadn't even had sex yet. So demisexuals obviously being people who need to get to know someone before forming a sexual or romantic attraction to
like
them.
a normal person.
So but in terms of the impact on girls, is it genuinely making us think that normal experiences of our sexuality are actually sexualities or identities of their own, such as demisexual, or because we like to take it slow? Essentially, we like to know a man before we do something so intimate.
Yeah, so when it comes to all these sort of bizarre Tumblr informed, and I think they did sort of start emerging on Tumblr around sort of 15 years ago, didn't they, or sort of 20 years ago, and then they somehow stuck I think those sort of niche identities are very much, if your template for what's normal sex has been derived from porn, Jesus Christ, of course you're going to look at it as a young woman and say, I don't want that. And of course it's going to, if you're a lesbian in particular, Jesus Christ, you don't want to be made into masturbatory fodder for a man. Of course that's going to be disgusting and alienating. So, it's totally unsurprising that there have been so many young lesbians who have sought to transition. And it's also unsurprising that so many straight men, I think, particularly at a time when, we know that pornography entrenches attitudes, really sexist attitudes and ideas about sex roles. And I can kind of see in a way that boys who don't fit that might as well start to question who they are and how they identify, and then obviously get a sexual kick out of the idea of submission and of cross-dressing, and without realizing that, without even being conscious that that's a fetish, perhaps just thinking that's what it is to be a woman, because what other frame of reference have they got? So, it's not like my heart bleeds for them, but at the same time, I can kind of understand they're victims in a way, to a degree as well. They should still stay the hell out of women's spaces. But at the same time, I can understand how they got there. Fetishes tend to cluster, so you get sort of paraphilias clustered together. So often men who cross-dress will also, they are more likely to be paedophiles. They are more likely to be into BDSM. These things do tend to go together, and as well, obviously, I think the sort of further down the pornography sort of vortex they go in terms of content selection algorithms, that can really mess up their sexuality even more. So yeah, and I think ultimately it's always going to benefit pornographers if people can't relate to one another, and if the only way they can get off is in front of a screen. That's then a captive market. So depressingly, I can totally see that there's an interest there in stopping people from relating to one another. And I guess whereas once we had identity politics, I firmly believe now we have sort of sexual identity politics, and the idea that what it is to be a good human being when it comes to identity is to have no sexual boundaries, is to be totally sexually fulfilled in a very male way. And I've been particularly disturbed by things like the fetishization of disability, because it's almost like you can't just recognize that a human being has a disability. The way you humanize them suddenly is to make them into a sexual object. I mean, that's grotesque and disgusting. We should be able to recognize human beings as human beings without needing to fetishize them. Yet that seems to be an underlying thing as well when it comes to identity formation.
You've mentioned Andrew Tate there, and it does seem that there's been an increase in violence against women and girls, especially sexual violence, but violence across the board. And influencers like Andrew Tate play a role where they've effectively normalized trafficking. He sort of informed his viewers, I make women fall in love with me. I trick them into falling in love with me. I bring them to, I think Albania. And then I make them get in front of the mic, get in front of the camera and create porn. And this has sort of it's been sold to boys almost as like a latent form of how they can make money off of relationships with women. Has there really been sort of, are we seeing an actual statistical increase in violence against women and girls as well? Or do you think that the tidal wave hasn't quite hit as hard as it will?
So what I think is the really depressing and dark thing is, I think at the moment, yeah, we have seen an increase in reports of sexual violence against women and girls, male sexual violence, but and indeed a reduction in successful prosecutions, and that's been ongoing. And every so often it says, "Oh, this is an epidemic. This is nothing ever seems to bloody happen." But at least, even with instances increasing, at least it shows it's still recognised as a problem. What really concerns me is in attitudinal surveys of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, it seems a lot of them don't even recognise what violence against women and girls is anymore. I know there was an End Violence Against Women and Girls survey. So it was a survey last year, 3,000 adults in the UK. Of all age groups, 74% recognised it can still be rape if a victim doesn't resist or fight back. But only 53% of the Generation Z cohort, so that was 18 to 24, recognise that. So it's only just over half, despite all the consent lessons and all the rest of it. They didn't recognise rape as rape if she didn't appear to fight back. And then there's 87% of people aged 65 and above understood that being in a relationship or a marriage doesn't mean consent to sex can be assumed. Only 42% of the youngest age group recognise that. So we're seeing a decline in what's accepted and recognised as sexual violence. And I think that that is directly related to porn scripts. So in a way, yes, there has been a recorded increase, but I don't think perversely that's necessarily a bad thing. Because I think when we stop recognising violence as violence, we know that we're really in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. I've read a statistic saying that if you are sexually assaulted or raped in this country, you have a less than 1% chance of seeing your attacker convicted.
Yeah.
And that's not accounting for, obviously, the number of rapes that go unreported. People have made the point before that we've effectively legalised rape. It is concerning. I mean, it's difficult to say that you have equal rights in a country as a woman if this form of violence is, so poorly prosecuted.
Yeah. And there's the longest waiting lists to get justice. I mean, yes, it's an absolute mess. I mean, to be fair, I think the entire criminal justice system appears to be bloody falling apart, but it is pretty grotesque that you can get sent to prison for Facebook posts. And yet, I think that's a pretty warped vision of priorities. But yeah, as I say, I worry that when those young people who've been brought up with pornography being totally normal, reach majority, get positions in institutions, those institutions will then obviously start to reflect their values. And if they think it's perfectly normal to choke a woman, or that it's acceptable that you can assume consent in marriage, then those things will be even further down the line to being decriminalised. So that's cheery. Sorry.
Perhaps it's not cheery, but it's certainly something that we have to face up to. So, what can we do? Women who are listening to this and who are worried about the future, what actions can we take on a ground level to protect future generations of women and girls?
I think that the networks that have developed recently to fight against transgenderism in the UK, frankly, finally, we are actually winning. I think we really are winning that now. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think we've got a long way to go. There'll be a lot of gnashing of teeth whilst we try and sort of root it out of institutions. But ultimately, we are getting there. And I think it'd be very useful. So those are obviously all women who recognise that sex is real, and that women are hard done by when we pretend it isn't, and that men pose a threat to women. So I think even if they haven't got the most in-depth feminist analysis or any of the rest of it, it doesn't matter. If we can just all agree that it is not acceptable for pornography to be normalised in a civilised society, and that it is a threat to women's personhood and indeed freedom of speech, then I think we could potentially see a similar sort of pushback against pornography as we have seen against transgenderism. Because at heart, at the root of the core, there's the same thing that we're fighting. Sometimes I find myself thinking, God, isn't it weird that women are being objectified and we're being sort of made into surrogates and we're being made into prostitutes and we're being blah 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 blah. And then I realise, no, actually, it's patriarchy. there's a word for it. So I think essentially if we can re-angle towards fighting pornography, that would help.
Yeah, there's so many fronts to fight on for women, but this one really does affect things from the ground up. I mean, we've spoken about across the board, in terms of synapses, brain development, addictive behaviours. It really has a wide-ranging impact. For people who've listened today and want to learn more, do you have a woman of the moment, someone that you would recommend that they check out, research?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite campaigners just is Julia Long, Dr. Julia Long. So she wrote a book, Anti-Porn Feminism, around about sort of 15 years ago now or so, I think. But she's better known basically for collaring politicians, for not letting them off the hook. So she asked Lisa Nandy quite a few years ago now about men being in women's prisons. She's collared Jess Phillips. She really puts politicians through their paces, and also leads women in some pretty good songs. So at demonstrations. So yeah, I think, and a lot of people, I don't agree with everything she says, and I'm sure vice versa. But I think a lot of people listen to what she says and think, "Oh my God, that's a bit harsh," and then a few years down the line, as I did myself, they go, "Oh, maybe she's got a point." And she's organised quite a few conferences as well, looking specifically at transgenderism. So I think one of the first was about 2012. I think she organised one.
I think it was in Leeds, wasn't it? And it was
Yes.
the first one where it didn't go ahead. They couldn't.
And then there was
right?
the Thinking Differently one in around at Conway Hall, and that sort of really kick-started, I think, the what's now known as the gender critical movement. Whether I'm not massively keen on that phrase, but basically, I think she's been instrumental in bringing women together. So yeah, she's a bit of a heroine of mine.
Well, she is of ours as well. She's been a guest on here, so she's great, and we love her, don't we, Bex?
Yeah, an excellent suggestion. Okay, perfect.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jo, for speaking to us, and thank you for listening for this long. We hope that you've really enjoyed this episode, and if so, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, and we really, really hope to see you in future episodes too.